Hello, everybody. It's such a privilege to come into your homes and be a part of your lives. Today I get to open the Bible, and I take that very seriously. I love to do it. I hope we're inspired by it. I hope, as always, Jesus gets bigger. The cross works better. The resurrection is central, and scriptures get bigger, not smaller. I want to talk to you about love and the nature of God and what that means for our world today and how that could affect our life in the future. Because we all know that love, at its best form, is not a celebration of the perfect. It's actually an embracing of the sublime. It's an embracing of the imperfection. It's actually fully knowing and yet fully accepting the person. Which brings me to God. I think I can identify with all of us. I think all of us are in the same boat, that at some point in our life, particularly our childhood, that God was framed as some sort of Santa Claus hybrid. And here's what I mean by that, is that he was presented kind and generous and wanted to provide good things for us. But he also kept score. So the illustration goes something like this, that, listen, there's a ledger. And I remember being told by I'm sure, a good-hearted Sunday school teacher, that there's a ledger, and you can't see the ledger. But on this side of that ledger of your life are the credits, and this side of the ledger of your life are the debits, and God is keeping score. And one day you'll stand before him. And that credit side had better be bigger than that debit side, or there is some serious consequences. It's just like Santa Claus that way. He's making a list. He's checking it twice. He's going to find out who's naughty or nice. It's that. So there's this generous gift giver, need meter God, but he's also determining what he feels about you by your score. And so the subtle, and actually not so subtle, pretty overt intimation is that God keeps score. And you know what? There's verses they could use for that. I'm sure that your grandparents and my grandparents used it to sort of try to control our behavior. They say, it sounds something like this. Hey, remember, even when mom's not around, even when granny's not around, God sees everything, right? It's like, shoot, yeah, like God sees everything. And I get it, yes, God does see everything. And do we need to be aware of that? Yes. Is there anywhere we could go to hide from the presence of God? No, and that should affect our behavior positively, absolutely. But what almost gets no playtime is the idea that God chooses in his love and in his consent to forget. So is it true that God sees and knows everything? Yeah. But when you only tell that side of the story, without telling the side of the story, and remember that God forgets in his love and in his consent, it can mess us up. Like I think it was G.K. Beale said that we become like who we worship. So here's the idea. If we believe that God keeps score, then we'll justify keeping score in our own lives, which will sabotage our relationships. It'll look like love in some weird, perverse way, but in actuality, it's more control and scorekeeping. And let me read this from Paul. This is from 1 Corinthians 13. And remember how Scripture's primary definition of what God is God is love. And so when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love is not proud, love does not have envy. It's not jealous, right? That we could actually replace the word love there with God is patient, God is kind, God is not puffed up. Because if God is love and love is those things, then we can intimate just using the transitive property. And so I want to read just one of those descriptions, and I want to talk about the implications of it. It's Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:5. Love keeps no record of wrong. That love keeps no record of wrong. Let's just stop. I'm doing this slow. I want us to let that sink in. If you have been tormented by the image of the ledger, credits, debits, and you start out basically bad anyway. If you've struggled with that image, I'm hoping this message will do a little bit to set us free from that. Because what that image says is it focuses entirely on God knowing everything. And it focuses almost none on God's choice in his love and in his consent to keep no record of wrong. Let's say it this way. God doesn't keep score. And the reason God doesn't keep score is because love doesn't keep score. Now, certain things keep score, and that's why scorekeeping has become a part of our life. We're athletics mad, right? And amen, I love my sports. But sports, you got to keep score. You got to have a winner and a loser. The problem is that if we believe God keeps score, and then we then allow that to flow into our lives, particularly our relationships, it actually sabotages them. Because certain things keep score, but it's not love and it's not God. Like fear will keep score. Like if you're afraid of some certain outcome, you might keep score. Or anxiety, it keeps score for sure. Anger definitely keeps score. Like if our default button is anger, we're looking for some reason to make sure that we're one-upping folks. We escalate the violence. Why? Because right now they're ahead of us. And so you see that in Samson, where he says, I'm going to do this, and as long as you don't do anything to overtake that, then I'll stop. I'm going to get even, and then I'll stop. I'm going to get even. That's scorekeeping. So any thought in our head that we should get even with someone who wronged us, scorekeeping? Any thought in our head that we have to get one up on someone so that they'll owe us, that's scorekeeping? Relationally, anytime we do something not out of love, but out of the idea that if I do this, I should get points that I can cash in later, scorekeeping. Unhappy people keep score. See, people, truly loving people, they don't do things for others in order to have points to cash in later. They do things for others because they actually love them and want to see them happy. Like, just some examples. Like, if I needed a ride to the airport at 4 a.m., and you say, sure, but then later you call me, and instead of just saying, I need a ride to the airport, you say, hey, remember when I took you to the airport at 4 a.m.? I'm going to need you. That's keeping score. Or maybe this sort of sentence is ringing a bell. Like, if you would pick up your clothes, maybe I would pick up on the things you like, right? Or if you just did this, maybe I would do this. This is scorekeeping language, and it hurts relationships. And ultimately, if you trace it back, it comes back to a belief that God keeps score. And if we believe God keeps score, then we'll naturally rationalize keeping score ourselves. Like, remember when you did that? Now I need you to do something for me. Or you owe me something. So I want us to be inspired. So there's a lot of biblical characters I could have picked, but I picked Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph is found in the book of Genesis, and it's so long that there's no way I'm going to read it. I'm just going to summarize it. If you want to go back and read it yourself, please do. It is an inspirational story. But just as a talking point sort of summary of the story, so that we can be inspired by him, Joseph was a part of a dysfunctional family with 12 brothers. And part of what made that dysfunctional family was the father preferred him more than the 11 brothers. And so he gives him a coat that he gives no one else. And he was one of the youngest. So it was totally breaking protocol. Now, Joseph doesn't help himself at all. In the middle of this dysfunctional family, he starts claiming to have dreams from God that, coincidentally exalt him. He says, hey, I've had a vision from God, guys. And in my vision, I'm standing and you're bowing. Well, this is not a way to win friends and influence people. To claim that God prefers you over them, that's not the way to win friends and influence people, because no one likes a vision where you're standing and they're bowing. So Joseph's brothers devise a plan to kill him. But instead of killing him, they sell him. Joseph is in charge of Potiphar's house. So he's been sold into slavery to a guy named Potiphar in Egypt. He's a slave in that house. He gets falsely accused of sexual assault and then gets put into prison for, if my memory's right, I think it was like 14 years. A long, long time. So if you're following along, he's a part of a dysfunctional family. His own brothers sell him into slavery. He ends up in jail, which it wouldn't be nice today. Definitely would have been worse back then, for 14 years. He interprets the dreams of fellow prisoners, resulting in one of them being reinstated to Pharaoh's favor. And he promised, I'll remember you when I'm there, but then he doesn't. So this story is full of tragedy. It's full of wrongs. It's a guy that lacks a little bit of wisdom in terms of how he shares his visions from God, but it's a byproduct of a dysfunctional family. Well, he's preferred. He ends up enslaved. He gets falsely accused of sexual assault. He ends up in prison for years. He helps get a guy out of prison who says, I'll remember you, and then he doesn't. There's all kinds of lessons in here about when you do something for somebody else and then they don't remember to return the favor. There's a lot of scorekeeping going on here. Pharaoh has a dream that stresses him, and the original prisoner then remembers. So Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in all of Egypt, 22 years after the whole process started. At that point, a famine hits Israel, and the brothers who sold him need his help. So if you're following along, dysfunctional family, sell the brother into slavery. He gets falsely accused of assault, ends up in prison. 22 years later, he ends up in charge based on a series of incredible circumstances. A famine hits Israel, and it just so happens that Egypt has food in storehouses that they can sell. So to save Israel's life, the brothers go into Egypt needing food from Egypt, only to find out that the brother they sold into slavery is in charge of who gets to buy and sell the food in Egypt. This thing is turning around big time, with Joseph having the opportunity to get back at his brothers. Joseph's father then dies, which instigates fear in his brothers that Joseph would have no reason to be kind. Because with the father dead, who cares what he does to the brothers? The whole thing culminates at a dinner table. The entire story culminates at a dinner table with 11 brothers sitting around the table with the Egyptian army behind them, waiting on a command from Joseph to kill them or to serve the food. There's all this intimation in this around the Hebrew idea of a table and a shulchan. A shulchan is a table. It also means reconciliation. To invite someone to a meal meant whatever was between us is now behind us. And Joseph is faced with this dilemma. What do I do? I have every opportunity to get back. 22 years of my life was taken away because of these guys. 22 years. Gone. I can get them back right now. Or I can choose to do something more profound and not keep score and do something different. This is Genesis chapter 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" In other words, if God wants to repay you for what you did, that's God's business, not mine. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So a couple of thoughts of inspiration around Joseph's life that could help us in terms of understanding that love doesn't keep score. One, Joseph prioritizes love, which allows his brothers to not be afraid. Joseph was in a dilemma between two ethics, and I think we all live in the dilemma between these two ethics. The two ethics are freedom and love. And neither are wrong. Actually, both are needed and both are good. To have liberty is a good thing. And when liberties get taken from us, that's a bad thing. But the question isn't which one's right and which one's wrong. The question is which one's lighter and which one's heavier. If we make freedom the highest ethic, then he could do whatever he wants to his brothers because they violated his liberty. But if we make love the highest ethic, then we have to at times humble ourselves in our liberty in order to make someone else's life better. It's exactly what you see with Christ on the cross. A God who chooses to make his freedom secondary to his love. And I think that's the challenge for all of us, is instead of calling one right and one wrong, one good and one bad, what if we see them both as good? But we choose to allow our freedom to be secondary to our love. Number two, Joseph frames his place in God's. He's like, look, I've got to keep what's in my pay grade. What's in my pay grade is whether I give you food or not. And if freedom is my highest ethic, then it's totally my choice and probably not because you don't deserve it. But if love is my highest ethic, then I have a certain responsibility to act in love. And he frames his place. His pay grade was this. God's pay grade is who gets paid back and what kind of retribution there is. That's his place in God's. Number three, Joseph chooses a perspective of gratitude. He steps back and goes, you know what? I'm going to make love the highest moral ethic. That's one. And two, I'm going to look at the situation and be thankful for what God brought out of it. I'm going to rejoice, in other words. I'm going to see what God has been up to in me, God's been up to in you, God's been up to in them, and the whole world's going somewhere good. That because of what you meant for evil, there's a lot of people whose lives are going to be saved because of that action. And he chose a perspective of gratitude. Number four, Joseph honors a position of grace. He steps back, He serves the food. He says, let's put this all behind us. He ends up giving them a piece of land. They end up becoming a huge family there. And then the story goes on into the book of Exodus. So a couple of observations about this. Joseph saw the potential for grace in the situation he found himself in. So let's stop and let's meditate on that for a second. Regardless of the conflict, can we see the perspective or the potential for grace in it? Where can we initiate the mercy? As Christ followers, we are meant to be initiators of mercy, acting in love. And what does that mean? Love keeps no record of wrongs. I want us to stop right there and let's wrestle with that for a second. Where have we violated love by keeping score? Where have we lost the perspective of grace because the scoreboard says they owe us? Number two, scorekeeping stops when we see the purpose to save, rescue, restore, and reconcile. Like what trumps scorekeeping is seeing the bigger picture. You meant this for evil, it means you owe me. Or I could see the bigger picture, and it took 22 years for me to see this, but look what God was up to in our world. And I couldn't see it the whole time, but now I see it. Scorekeeping gets trumped when our awareness is around the saving, the rescuing, the restoration, and the reconciliation. Number three, he says, serve the food. When we keep score, we take a potential unity and turn them into the other. We scapegoat the enemy as the entire problem instead of seeing the perspective to serve the food. In the scripture, there's a psalm that says, he prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. In Hebrew culture, that doesn't mean God was feeding you and not them. It meant God was always making a way to reconcile, even when they don't deserve it. A couple of thoughts on this in terms of relationships. One, scorekeeping cheapens the relationship into a competition. When we violate love by keeping score, when we violate love by keeping a record of wrongs or rights, and honestly, when we're keeping records of wrong and rights, we normally don't really score our wrongs correctly. We tend to exaggerate our rights and we tend to diminish our wrongs. But when it comes to somebody else, we tend to exaggerate their wrongs and diminish their rights. And so when we do that, it cheapens the possibility and the potential for a loving relationship down to a competition. When we keep score, we start to believe that God keeps score. And actually, when we keep score, it shows us that we always believed God kept score. And I want to be fair, because this is my story, and I'm assuming it's most of yours, is that we were taught when we were kids that God kept score. That there's a ledger. You better have more credits than debits. And they use the scripture, God knows everything. And is that true? Yes, it is. But we also need to be aware that God in his love and in his consent allows his freedom to keep score, to be secondary to his choice to love. And love keeps no record of wrongs. See, if God keeps score, then the whole beautiful, holy, divine life inside of us simply gets dumbed down to a score. Some people are ahead, some people are behind. Some people are in, some people are out. And if we ever framed God that way to our world, it would be tragic. See, the real danger in scorekeeping is that it violates the love of God as represented on a cross. What's the answer to God's scorecard? The cross. If you want to know what God's like, check Jesus on the cross. A God who validates his deity by choosing not to be God and suffer with others. So you know what? The score is now level. The score is, there is no, love keeps no record of wrongs. And if we can pound that into us, and I realize it's going to take more than one 20-minute sermon to get that through, to undo years in our childhood of being told God keeps score. God knows everything. And yes, God does know everything. But you know what's beautiful? Is when we remember that in his love, he consents to forget. That love keeps no record of wrongs. That sin is thrown as far as the east is from the west. Can't get further than that. That it's out of it. The sea of forgetfulness was another metaphor. That in his love, he consents to not keep score. So a couple of thoughts about this I want us to wrestle with. For application. Jesus didn't die simply to fix a problem, but to destroy an entire framework of living by scorekeeping. See, the system Jesus came up in was nothing but scorekeeping. Oh, you did this, and there was clear score. If you do this and it was unintentional, you owe a bird. If it was this and it was intentional, you owe a goat. And there was all of this well thought out scorekeeping, because early on they believed in a scorekeeping God. Jesus came to reveal. In 1 John 4:8, it says that Christ was sent to reveal the love of God to the world. So what if Jesus' primary purpose for coming was to show the world what God's love is actually like? And one of the things he actually did was he destroyed the entire system of scorekeeping. Let's say it this way. Are we violating love in our marriages? Are we violating the nature of love and actually losing a profound opportunity to experience a loving relationship because we're keeping score? Or are we violating in our relationships and our friendships? Do we keep scores? Do we exaggerate our rights and diminish our wrongs while exaggerating their wrongs and diminishing their rights, and then somehow keeping score and who's got points and who can cash in a favor somewhere? Where are we violating that when there's a more beautiful way to live, to just ask, seek, and knock, and loving people respond? Let's say it this way. Are we feeling hopelessly behind the score? If you grew up with the idea that God keeps score and there's a credit and there's a debit, maybe you're struggling right now going, you know what? I don't think I can catch up on that score. The beautiful part of the gospel is that God doesn't keep score. Let's say it this way. Where do we need to remember that God keeps no record of wrongs? So I come to you today with a message of hope. That God in his love consents to forgive and forget. That love keeps no record of wrongs. So God doesn't. You're never hopelessly behind the scoreboard. So may we profoundly connect to that in a way that we free others from us keeping score on them. And maybe we can experience what a profound, loving relationship might look like. I hope Jesus got bigger for you today. Grace and peace, everybody.